So this video is going to look at a really important concept in macroeconomics, which is economic growth. And what we're going to look at in this video is firstly what we mean by economic growth, and then also how we can try and make sure that the figure that we generate is as meaningful as possible. So let's start with that first bit then. Let's start with what economic growth means. So we define economic growth in the Edexcel specification as the percentage increase in real GDP from one period to the next. So for instance, at the moment, the UK, the most recent figures have shown that we have a 2% rate of economic growth on an annual basis. And what that means is that at our current rate of economic growth, the size of our economy would grow by 2% each year. And as we may well recall from the previous video, GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. And what that means is the total value, or gross, so the gross value of all of the output, all of the product which is made within an economy, i.e. in the domestic area. So gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced within an economy. So when this increases from one period to the next, when an economy produces more than it did in a previous period, then we can say that economic growth has taken place. And the reason we're looking at this is because what we are wanting to do is we assume that if there is an increase in real GDP, then that means that there will be an increase in income levels within the economy, and therefore we assume, importantly, that there'll be an increase in the standard of living. And it's really that we are trying to figure out here. The reason we calculate things like economic growth and so on is so that we can try and measure how the standards of living are changing within an economy, and that's going to be important as we move on to the next bit. So economic growth, then, the percentage increase in real GDP from one period to the next, GDP meaning the gross domestic product, and if we've got an increase in GDP, then we would expect there to be an increase in income, and if there's an increase in income, then we would expect there to be an increase in the standard of living. But as we're going to see on the next slide, there are a few things which we need to do to this figure really in order to make it an accurate reflection, or a more accurate reflection, of the standard of living within an economy. So let's have a look at those things in a bit more detail. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider a model. Now, a model is something that we do a lot as economists, and what we're basically doing here is we are simplifying a real-world situation, so it's something that we can deal with a little bit more easily. And we will come across an awful lot of these as we work our way through the economic course. But here we go. Let me just explain what we've got going on here. So we're talking about a very simple economy where we only produce one good, and that good are widgets. And so what we can see is that the total value of widgets produced within our economy in 2014 was 100,000, and the total value of widgets produced in 2015 was 110,000 units of currency. So let's call them pounds just to make life a little bit easier for us. So what that then means, and hopefully your maths is up to this, percentage change is an important calculation to be able to do in economics. The percentage change that we've got there is 10%. So from 2014 to 2015, the growth in the value of the widgets being produced was 10%. And that means then that we would have a straightforward increase in the GDP figure of 10%. But there are a number of things which may also be going on in the economy at the same time, which means that actually, although the value of widgets has gone up by 10%, actually not all of that necessarily translates into an increase in standard of living. So let's have a think about some of the things that might have been going on. Let's say, for instance, that in that same period, from 2014 to 2050, there was an increase in the population of our country. So in 2014, the population of our country was 1,000 people, and in 2015, it was 1,040. Now, that represents a growth in the population of 4%. So although we've got an increase in the total value of the widget, we've got more people in our economy, essentially, that we need to share that growth out between. So the growth, when we think about it on a per person basis, or to use the terminology per capita, is going to be less than 10%. So if we look at per capita growth, we round it off ever so slightly, we basically end up with a per capita economic growth of around 6%. It's actually 5.7-ish, but if we round to the nearest percent, it's 6. So what we can see there is that although the kind of the absolute, I suppose, what we call the nominal level of growth, or the overall level of growth, is 10%, the per capita growth is only 6, because we've got to divide it out across more people. Let's think about something else that may have happened. Let's say, again, during the period of 2014 to 2015, there was an increase in the price of widgets. Now, as we said, widgets are the only thing that we make and produce within this country. So that means that we essentially have inflation. We have an increase in general prices within the economy. So if in 2014 they were £10 and in 2015 they were £10.20, that represents a 2% increase in the price of widgets. Now, because the price of widgets has gone up, it means that actually, in terms of what our 6% income growth will buy, it won't actually buy 6% more widgets, because their price has also risen. So it would have bought 6% more widgets when the price was 10, but now that the price has gone up by 2%, as you can probably see, that is going to reduce the what we call real per capita growth. Try and squeeze this in. The real per capita growth then drops to about 4%. Again, I've rounded that one off slightly. That would actually be 3.6, nearly 3.7% in reality, but just to make the numbers a little bit easier to deal with. So what we can see there then essentially is that we end up with initially a very favourable economic growth rate. 10% would be incredibly desirable as far as kind of governments of an economy would be concerned. There are hardly any countries, even China at the height of its growth period was only just achieving that sort of level of growth. But actually, when we think about that, if there is an increase in population and also if there are an increase in prices, then you can see how actually looking at this 10% value might be unrealistic. It might give a significantly more favourable impression of the economy than is actually the case. So when we're looking at economic growth figures, you want to try and make sure you are looking at the figures which give you the most accurate reflection. And what we try to look at is the level of real per capita growth in GDP when we're talking about economic growth, because that takes account of changes in, as we've already seen, the population within the economy and the general price level. So trying to look at the real per capita growth is the way forward. Let's just look at that in a slightly different way then, without the numbers, to see if we can explain this in a little bit more clearly. So we start off with our nominal GDP growth, and that's the increase in the value of everything that we've produced within our economy. What we then need to do is we need to take account of the effects of inflation, of the effects of price change. So we go from nominal GDP growth to real GDP growth. The next thing we need to take account of then is any change in population which might have occurred during this period of time. So that moves us on to real GDP growth per capita meaning per head of population within the economy. So when we're trying to compare two economies, we would want to really use this real GDP growth per capita as the best way of comparing economies. There is one other thing as well, which we will look at in a little bit more detail, that we need to take account of, and that is differences in exchange rates and costs of living between economies. So it's all very well saying that one country has a higher real GDP growth per capita than another, but it may well be that differences in the costs of living or the exchange rate are actually affecting that. So there is one more measure as well that we can use. As I said, we will look at this in more detail in a later video, and that is real GDP growth per capita at PPP. And PPP is a shortened way of saying, and we generally use it, you'll see why, because PPP means purchasing power parity. So what that means, what we're using this for then, is to measure that real GDP growth per capita in terms of what it will actually buy in that economy, by considering how far that money will go in that economy. So essentially, as we're descending the structure there that you can see from nominal GDP growth at the top all the way down to real GDP growth per capita or purchasing power parity, we are essentially getting a more accurate reflection, hopefully, of changes in standard of living within an economy. So hopefully that just takes you through some of the key terminology that we use when we talk about economic growth. Again, you just need to be very aware when you're looking at any GDP data, what it actually is you're looking at. And when somebody says to you economic growth, you need to ask a few more questions about exactly what form, so you know what it is you're talking about. But hopefully that will help you understand the terminology and the data as we move through the rest of the course.